Welcome back to the afternoon program of our 37th annual convention. And we're going to try to stay on schedule, so people might like to be seated. And if Francisco Alonso is here, can you stand up? I wanted to introduce Francisco. He was the mayor of the city of Monterey Park. In 1997, and then again in 2003, and when he was mayor, that city didn't have a prayer. So, Dan, this.
So I've been meeting a lot of you, including a lot of former preachers, and some of the members of the Clergy Project are here. Like me, we actually saw the light. Are there any former clergy or Clergy Project member or any active? Stand up and say hi. John Compier, Dick Hewitson. Who else do I see? John Compier was, I think, a fifth-generation Southern Baptist preacher, who, or something like that. And he's one of the screeners for the Clergy Project, and some of the other screeners are here as well. Clergy who are in the pulpit and they don't believe anymore. And so how do you get out? So introduce yourself to some of them. They have horns. You'll see them. Our next speaker was a child preacher. Anthony Pinn was preaching at the age of 12 years old. So he also would fit right in with the Clergy Project. We're really, really honored to have Dr. Anthony Pinn here with us today. He is the Agnes Cullen Arnold Professor of Humanities and Professor of Religious Studies at Rice University in Houston. He founded and directs the African American Religious Studies doctoral program and the Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning at Rice. He's an executive committee member of the Society for the Study of Black Religion. He's a member of the Meadville Lombard Theological School Board of Trustees, and he served in various executive roles of the American Academy of Religion. He got his Ph.D. from Harvard in 1994. He got his B.A. from Columbia, and his MDiv. Are all the divinity students and Harvard non-believers? Maybe. I've met a number of them, and they all said the divinity school was like at least half atheists there. So that tells you something. Tells you Harvard's come a long way. He was raised in the AME church, which he might tell you about. And, he started preaching before I did. My first sermon was at 8:15, so you had a big head start on me. He has a new book in which he tells his personal story. He has a lot of books, but his most recent one that I know about is a memoir. It's called Writing God's Obituary. What a great title. And in case there's any doubt about his personal views, the subtitle of the book is How a Good Methodist Became a Better Atheist. He'll be signing copies of this memoir at the end of this afternoon. So after we're all done, you can go get a copy of his excellent book. You might have heard him on Free Thought Radio tell a little bit about his story. He's the first African-American full professor to hold an endowed chair in the history of Rice University. He's also director of research for the Institute for Humanist Studies. He's a member of the board of directors for the American Humanist Association. His teaching and research interests spanned liberation theology, black religious aesthetics, religion and popular culture, and African American humanism. And some of us are surprised to know how many humanists, African American humanists, have contributed so much to free thought and to our country. He's co-editor of 3 book series, and with Caroline Levander, if that's how you say her name, Imagining the Americas, Oxford University, Innovations in Black Womanist Theologies and Ethics, and Religion and Social Transformation. He also has, he's been the editor of 29 books, most recently Introducing African American Religion in 2012, and The End of God Talk, and African American Humanist Theology. So you may not remember this, but we've been trying to get you to come talk to us for a long time. You're just too popular. You're too busy, writing too many books. I think since the 1980s, we've been trying to get Anthony Pinn to come speak. So we're very, very pleased and very honored to have him at our convention today. So, Dr. Pinn. Or I should say, Brother Pinn.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I know you finished lunch and you're trying to be LA hip, but you don't lose cool points by saying hello, so let's try that again. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
That's what I'm talking about. That's better. I'm delighted to be here with you, and I want to thank my new friends from Freedom from Religion Foundation for this invitation. I'm glad we were finally able to work it out. I turned 50 this year in May. I turned 50. I've been a bit too lazy for a midlife crisis, but it has given me opportunity to think. And my life divides fairly evenly between two kind of diametrically opposed positions on life. Now, I'm one who believes that there are certain elements of human existence, our movement through the world, that are best expressed through the poetic. So I'll help you get a sense of what these two poles, these two contradictory stances entail through song. No, I won't sing the songs, but I'll tell you what the songs are. The first phase of my life is roughly summed up by the hymn Amazing Grace. Some of you may know this, yeah? Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. 1779, the same year that enslaved Africans in Connecticut petitioned for their freedom. That's the first phase. The second phase of my life, the second 25 years, better summed up by this hauntingly beautiful song, first published in 1964, the year of my birth, but really given oomph, right? Given oomph, and becomes a standard in 1965 when Nina Simone decides to sing it. One of the lines from this song is this: freedom is mine and I know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life for me, and I'm feeling good. That sums up the second phase of my life. The second phase of my life is marked by a certain type of lucidity or awareness. It is for me a way of recognizing and honoring what my grandmother told me as she sent me off to college. This second phase kind of sums this up nicely. She said, Tony, walk through the world knowing your footsteps matter. Walk through the world knowing your footsteps matter, that life is embodied and how you interact with others, the sorts of relationships you form or don't form have impact. You're not in this alone. You're not doing this simply for yourself. Move through the world knowing your footsteps matter. So I've spent 50 years on this earth moving between these two poles, and this is nothing anyone would have anticipated for me. No one would have anticipated this for me. My family was part of the Great Migration. Perhaps you've heard of this mass movement of African Americans into southern and northern cities after the Civil War through the mid-20th century, looking for opportunity, a way of integrating themselves into U.S. life, opportunity. My mother's family moved from Halifax, North Carolina to Buffalo, New York. My grandparents were college educated, but that didn't mean much. My father's family moved from a small town in Virginia, Dinwiddie, Virginia, also to Buffalo. And they moved to Buffalo because right outside of Buffalo was Lackawanna. And in Lackawanna was Bethlehem Steel. And Bethlehem Steel meant opportunity. A good paycheck, a good life. So they made that transition. I always told my mother that they must have gotten a little tired and a little lazy and just didn't make it all the way to Canada. But Buffalo was okay. Only an hour from Toronto, I could live with this. But we grew up in Buffalo. Most of my family living within 3 miles of my grandparents. And we grew up in Buffalo, and the church was extremely important. I can remember as a small child going to church with my grandfather in Lackawanna to a small Baptist church. He was one of the deacons, one of the leaders of this church, and I didn't quite understand what was going on. We'd go to Sunday school, and we'd listen to Sunday school lessons that really had nothing to do with our inner city lives. Jane and Jim were nothing like my neighbors. But we listened to these stories, and somehow they were connected to Scripture that we didn't quite understand. Then came the big service, right? The service for the adults, the big service. And we went to that, but we had our own way of entertaining ourselves. We had a game we would play. Each child on the row got a hymnal. And you'd close your eyes and open up the hymnal quickly, and you'd look. And the goal was to eventually land on the same hymn. And if you landed on the same hymn, it was great joy, and then you moved on to the next challenge. The final challenge was going to the restroom and staying away for an extended period and being able to explain it. Now, sometimes this worked, sometimes it didn't, and sometimes my grandfather would catch us, and all he had to do was look. Just that look behind those rather thick, cloudy glasses, and you knew, that's it. Well, we stayed at that church for a while until my mother decided that was not the proper environment for us, that she did not want us growing up in a church in which women were second-class citizens, in which women could clean but they couldn't preach. So we left, and we started attending a small independent church much closer to my home. This church would eventually affiliate with the AMEs, but when we arrived, it was independent, and it was run by this dynamic minister who was down to earth. My mother loved it, and it made sense to the rest of us. My mother and my sister went to service one day, and I didn't go that Sunday. But they got home, and my mother announced that she and my sister had joined the church. And I'm thinking, well, my sister's older, Linda's older, but there's nothing she gets to do that I don't do. Next Sunday, I'm in church, and I play my games. I take a little nap, and I wake up, and I ask my mother what those folks are doing who are walking to the front of the church, and she says they're joining the church. And I think, well, okay, I want to do that too. So I leave the pew, walk to the front, and announce my name. I'm Anthony Bernard Pinn, and I care to join this church. And that was the beginning. We had a new family. It provided cultural network. It provided social networks. It was a space in which we could breathe, right? A space in which we could have a bit of comfort in what seemed to be a death-dealing society. It was a space apart. What Starbucks might call the third space, right? Between home and work, for us, it was church. It was a space away from all of the madness. It was a space away from my grammar school teachers who really didn't give a damn about me. Right? As long as I stayed out of trouble, didn't create waves, everything was good. Doesn't matter if he's learning anything or not. But this was a different space in which my talents were assumed and pushed. So we loved this space. And it was fairly small, so the minister also taught Sunday school, and I was in his Sunday school class, and one particular Sunday, he had us in his office. We sat in a circle, and after the lesson, he asked a typical question: what do you want to be when you grow up? So there were the typical responses. I'm going to be president. I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be a lawyer. He got to me, and I said, I'm going to be a preacher. I'm not quite certain why I said it. I'm not certain what I anticipated his reaction would be, but I said it. And he looked at me and said, okay, we start next Sunday. So the games were over. Yeah, the games were over for me. The games were over for me. That following Sunday, with my mother's permission and a big smile on her face, I mounted the pulpit. I lined hymns, collected the offering, said prayers, opened the doors of the church. Right? I was a little minister with a very different role. I couldn't go to the store alone. I had to be in the house when the street lights came on. But in the context of that church, I had a certain type of authority simply because I said, I'm going to be a preacher. Eventually, that minister left and another came and he left. And then this young guy arrived from Philadelphia who was known for growing churches. And this church needed to grow. It was now affiliated with the African Methodist Episcopal denomination, the oldest black denomination in the country. And it needed to grow. So they brought in this minister. And folks told him, you know, Tony has a call on his life. He's going to be a minister. And he, I'll check this out. Eventually, at age 12, I preached my first sermon, my trial sermon. Now, the real test of a sermon, right, Dan, is not how many people get happy with you. The real test of a sermon is how many people come to Christ as a result of what you've said. So that first sermon, all about fire and brimstone, 3 people came, so I was on my way. So I went through the process, yes. I went through the process, meeting with church leaders, meeting with church officials, proving this calling, and I was on my way. I was a youth minister in this church, and I can't stay out past a certain hour, can't go to the store alone, but I'm leading people to Christ. I'm counseling people on issues I didn't really understand, on topics I couldn't necessarily pronounce. But this is what I was doing. I was a minister, and I was into it. I was into it. My grandmother told me, look, I'm so proud of you, but understand this. I would not make use of an attorney who didn't have a J.D., nor would I make use of the services of a physician without an M.D., and my grandson will not be a preacher without proper training. So I knew education within my family had always been important, and at this stage I knew that beyond the BA I would have to get professionally trained for ministry, and this was fine with me. My oldest sister was working on a Ph.D., and I thought, well, if she gets one, I'm not quite certain what it is, but I want two. So it was clear to me, yes, that this education was a component of this. So I worked and worked and worked, and I worked and worked and worked. And I decided, along with my mother, that it would be most beneficial for me to be in an educational environment with folks who were like-minded. The public school system was not going to cut it. I had to be in the world but not of it, and the school was not helping. So my sophomore year in high school, I transferred from City Honors, a program for gifted students, to this small Southern Baptist school outside of the city of Buffalo, New York. Small Southern Baptist high school outside the city of Buffalo, New York. It was run by a large Southern Baptist church, and this school was a feeder program for institutions like Bob Jones University and Liberty Baptist. Need I say more? But this is where I was, because my understanding was, yes, education is important, but it's got to be filtered through the Word. Yeah, it's got to be filtered through the Word. So I spent 3 years at this place. I'm unlearning critical thinking skills and embracing Scripture. Now, it was time for college, and the question was where. I knew I could not stay in Buffalo because I was surrounded by folks who had limited ambition, and I needed more than that. I needed more than that, not simply because of my family, but because I felt I had this call, and this call involved getting the most you can get, yeah? Being aggressive about training. I had to get out of Buffalo, New York. It just so happened that the minister of the church had just been transferred to a rather large church in New York City, Brooklyn, New York, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and I took this as a sign from the Lord. Go to school in New York. So Columbia was my place, and I arrived, and I'm thinking, I'm going to set this world on fire for Christ. I'm going to lead these folks to Jesus. They just don't know what's in store for them, yeah? But I was in for a surprise. I'm taking classes in biblical studies, and these folks are treating the Bible as if it's simply a piece of literature. Right? They did not appreciate a deeper understanding of Scripture, and this threw me. And they talked about it as literature, and they didn't apologize for this. And I'm meeting people who are practitioners of other faiths, and they practice these faiths with devotion and without apology. And it didn't matter to them that, from my perspective, they were going to hell. They did not care. But get this was the thing that really got me. Some of these folks who were not Christian, who were on their way to hell, treated me consistently better than so many of the Christians I encountered. Yeah? They didn't talk about me behind my back. They weren't really looking for me to slip up and prove that I was human. They treated me better than the other, and this was just freaking me out. And I'm working at this church in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and this was Bedford-Stuyvesant in 1982, not Bedford-Stuyvesant in 2014, and it wasn't gentrified. It was an area of New York that was deeply troubled by economic want and need, and people found ways to pacify that want and need. Early 80s, crack cocaine becomes a way of doing this, yeah? It's cheap, readily available, and numbs the pain. And I'm at a church in the middle of this, and we said nothing that eased life for these folks. I'm working with young people who are finding it easier to plan out their deaths than to think about a bright future. And they're struggling with this in the basement of a church that believes it has the way. I had nothing to say that really made much of a difference, even in terms of basic life circumstances and needs, like sex education. I was the youth minister. I'm 18, 19 years old. I'm the youth minister, yes? And so one of my responsibilities was to provide these young people with a way to think about their sexual wants, desires, yeah? And I thought I was just clever, that I had it, right? That I had this one statement that was going to transform life for them and make it easy to avoid sexual sin. And this is what I would say with a rather stern but caring and compassionate look on my face. You can do whatever you want, wherever you want, whenever you want. Pause. Knowing that Jesus is in the room with you. And I'm thinking, damn, this is brilliant, right? This is just brilliant, right? Brilliant that this will just work. I had nothing to say that made a felt difference in the life circumstances of these folks, that they were confronted with the same sort of dilemma that the writer Richard Wright describes in terms of his own life. In Black Boy, he says, look, if I had encountered the church before I encountered the harshness of the world, the songs and the sermons would have meant something to me. But he says he encountered the world first, and the church could not fix the suffering he felt. I gave them nothing that really made a difference Monday through Saturday. And this was becoming difficult for me because I wanted to be a person with integrity. This was difficult for me. And it reached a point where I just couldn't do it. It was a kind of dissonance that I couldn't deal with, and this was my solution. I was supposed to be at the 6 o'clock a.m. service every Sunday morning. Now, that was not a challenge because I thrived on very little sleep, right? This is what we went around boasting about. I haven't slept in 3 days. This was a good thing, yes? I've had 4 all-nighters, right? So everybody bragged. Not sleeping was not an issue. So getting there was not a problem, but not having anything to say that made a difference, a theology that was anemic at best and perverse at worst, it just wasn't getting the job done. So this is what I would do some Sundays when it was just too much. I'd get dressed in my suit and I'd make my way to the train station on 116th Street and Broadway, and I'd let the train pass. And I'd sit down, and next train would come, I'd let it go. Third train would come, I'd let it go. I'd get on the next train and make my way to 59th Street to get on that famous A train into Brooklyn, and I'd let one pass. I'd look at the clock, and I'd let another one pass, and I'd look again, and perhaps I'd need to let a third pass. And I wouldn't get on the train until I was fairly confident that I could get to Brooklyn late enough not to have to participate in the service. I'd get off the train at Boys and Girls High School, a rather troubled high school, troubled high school. And I'd make that slow walk down to the church. I'd walk in and sit in the back, and the minister, no doubt, would look at me coming in, and I'd just and afterwards I'd tell him, Doc, I'm sorry, the train. But it gave me an opportunity to catch my breath and not participate in activities that I didn't think made a damn difference. Now, I was still committed to ministry, but my idea of God was changing radically. It went from the idea of a God who breaks into human history and makes things happen to a God who works by persuasion, what my mother described as that small, still voice attempting to get us to do the right. I was moving from this kind of evangelical fundamentalist position to something more along the lines of the social gospel, but it still wasn't getting it done. I was going to be in ministry, but I had to figure out a way to do this. And so my motto became Adam Clayton Powell Jr., for whom the church and theology were about socio-political and economic change, that the church was an opportunity to organize to get some real stuff done. This was beginning to make sense to me. So I was going to seminary, but I wasn't going to go in New York because I had to have space to think without the demands and the assumptions of my church family. My church family thought I had the answers. I had questions, and questions I couldn't share with them. Right? Because the minister is supposed to know. Or if the minister doesn't know, he, and it's usually he, knows how to get the answers. So I had to leave, and I wanted to go to a place where my sense of ministry would not matter at all. That it was about learning, critical thinking skills. I was just getting those again, and I wanted to be able to exercise those, so I decided Harvard Divinity School was the place to go because they didn't really care about Jesus. Right, and when I told church family that I was thinking about going to Harvard Divinity School, they, why do you want to go to the cemetery, right? That was their way. They didn't say seminary, it was cemetery, right? Because this is where good religious ideas go to die. So I knew that is the place. So I'm there. I'm there and I'm working, I'm trying to make this thing work. I want to be involved in ministry, but it had to be a ministry that made a felt difference in the lives of people. It had to be about the business. It had to help them transform their mundane existence. It had to involve a way of making it through the world with integrity and dignity. It had to be a different type of faith. So I'm trying to work on this, and I'm a youth minister at a small church in Roxbury, not Roxbury 2014, but Roxbury 1989 in Boston. They're just integrating public housing, some public housing there, like Mary Ellen McCormick. It was just integrated around that time, right? There are clear markers of economic need, and I'm working at this church, and one of the clear symbols of this need was the park across the street. It wasn't the kind of park with soft nets on the basketball hoops. These were metal nets, that cut fingers and required tetanus shots. But this park was home to a variety of activities, little kids having fun, but it was also home to drug deals and prostitution, and it was across the street from the church, and we had very little to say about it. I asked the minister about our ministry and what we could do in the context of our preaching, for example, to make a difference, and he told me, Pinn, let the people get happy with you, but I'm not happy. Right, because I'm not making a difference. Young people from the church are literally dying. They can't get out of gang activity because of where they live. Yeah, because of where they live, they can't get out of gang activity. They're in the church. Every day I want them to be in the church. But they're dying, literally dying. Now, James Baldwin said, growing up in Harlem, that it became clear to him you had to belong to something, right? That you could not survive in that environment without belonging to something. You had to belong to something. He said you could belong to the drug dealers, you could belong to the pimps, you could belong to the church. He said, I'll pick the church. These young people had to belong to something, and the church was not deeply compelling. And I had nothing to say that made a difference. And I beat myself up for a long time, and then I realized that it wasn't me, it was this faith that had nothing to contribute to the life circumstances of these folks, nothing that would make a damn difference in how they lived Monday through Saturday. It wasn't me, it was the faith. So I'm wrestling with this, trying to hold on to something of theism. I'm desperate to hold on to something. But it reached a point where I had to make a decision. Do the people matter, or is it the tradition that matters? Am I about trying to do something to make a felt difference in the lives of people who matter? Or am I preserving the workings of a tradition? And I decided the people matter most. And I wasn't going to be a hypocrite. There were lots of things I was willing to be, but I was not going to be a hypocrite. So I could no longer stand in the pulpit preaching what I did not believe. That was not going to work for me. It wasn't worth the paycheck. Yeah? It was not worth the paycheck. So I contacted the minister and said, I'm done. I won't be on the staff anymore. I can't do it. I've got to think, I've got to process, I've got to figure out what religion is and if it can matter in any shape or form. I can't do this. I contacted my bishop and surrendered my ordination and said, I'm no longer involved in AME ministry, period. It did not matter to me what people thought because I had to live with integrity. It didn't matter to me if I lost family or friends. I had to live with integrity. Right? I had to live in the world in a way that I could respect. I had to be true to what my grandmother told me. Move through the world knowing your footsteps matter. That was what was of most importance to me. But I remained interested in religion. It was a force that needed to be wrestled with. It was a force that had shaped world events in some profound ways, and I needed to understand it. I needed to understand it. A major cultural force I needed to understand. And for me, understanding it involved coming up with hellified questions that were just good. Not so much answers, but questions that forced thinking, that from my perspective, if we could get people to think critically about the world, we're set. If you can get people to think critically about the world and give them effective communication strategies, they can make some stuff happen. So for me, that was the next phase. I'd finished the Ph.D., and I'd spend my time trying to understand this thing. But in addition to that, trying to give greater attention to the ways in which humanism and atheism has influenced and affected life in the United States beyond white folks. It was a bit of a novel thought. That you folks don't own this. Yeah? But it surprised people. So I needed to spend time, one, understanding the nature and meaning of religion, how this functions, and religion particularly in the form of theism. But I also wanted to give attention to how atheism and humanism function within the context of racial minorities. Racial minorities, of course, if you only think in terms of certain segments of the world, yeah? But I needed to understand how this thing happened because from my perspective, I'd left the church, but I'd entered a much larger community. Kind of nebulous in nature, but a larger community. And I was convinced from that moment forward that humanists and atheists, even within my African American communities, are legion. Thank you. So I think we have time to chat. Yeah?
I've often wondered why blacks seem to be interested in religion out of proportion to their numbers. Is it history and slavery, or a feeling of hopelessness or hopefulness, or what? Could you clarify that a bit?
I knew this question was coming. Right? It's not always first, right? Because folks typically have to kind of warm up to it, but I always get this question. Right, and it seems to me there are two things I'd want to say on this, right? The first is we have to think in more complex ways concerning religion. And for me, I want to make a distinction between religion, which is a kind of binding together, and theism. From my perspective, the real problem isn't religion, it's theism. And these are overlapping, but they're not identical, right? So the problem is theism. There are a variety of reasons why African Americans over the context of time would embrace this, yeah? One, folks with power had it. And if these folks with power had this thing, maybe this thing could get them something, right? So there are pragmatic reasons for embracing this, but we cannot forget that although Christianity within the context of African American communities in the U.S. in much larger terms has done a lot of damage, there are ways in which, in a rather flat way, it spurred a demand for personhood. You cannot take away from the Christian faith in African American communities the slave revolts. Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, all ministers. Yeah? So it's an incomplete process that forces them to surrender something of themselves, but there are ways in which it involved a push for personhood. Yeah? But let's also think about it this way. There would be little reason for African Americans to assume that humanism and atheism provides a softer landing point. Yeah? I'll give you one example and then we'll move on. I hear so many humanists and atheists celebrating Thomas Jefferson. This is one of our dudes, right? He's one of us. But as soon as you say that, you have linked humanism to slavery. As soon as you do that, you've linked humanism to slavery. This is the man who says, this far but no further, because it's going to mess up Virginia and it's going to mess up the nation. Yeah? So as soon as you embrace him, you've linked humanism to slavery. Yeah? And here's the fundamental problem on that end. Too many humanists and atheists believe that disbelief, non-theism, is a prophylactic against nonsense. Right? That because I don't believe in religion, I cannot be guilty of racism, classism, sexism, homophobia. Yeah? Yeah, I've heard this. I've heard this, right? And this is a problem because it doesn't allow us to take these issues seriously. And African American non-believers are in the shadows looking at you, wrestle with these issues in an inadequate fashion. So give them an alternative. Give racial minorities in the United States a soft landing spot, and that involves doing more than just critiquing the traditions they're leaving. Right? Give them something positive. Yeah? Hey.
Hello, yes. I think you touched on what I was going to ask you very beautifully, and well, since you already answered my question, I want to thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Just a simple question. Where can I get your reading list for any of your classes that you teach? I'm just interested in what you've studied.
Email me.
Email? Okay.
Yeah, it's last name, PINN @rice.edu, and identify the conversation in the subject line.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, I'm not very good with phone calls, but I am excellent with email and text messages. I'm a text messaging pro.
Hi. I was wondering, you know how a gentleman brought up the subject of our numbers being disproportionate. You know, a lot of African Americans are disproportionately religious. And so I was wondering about a way to get more minorities in general to come out of the closet, because it's it seems particularly rough for minorities to come out the closet. So to get a bigger recruiting, a better way of recruiting, you know.
Well, let me start with a bit of historical context, right? So it seems to me, and I think there's evidence to support this, that churches in the context of the United States declined numerically after the Civil Rights Movement. That's not just black churches. Churches declined in the United States after the Civil Rights Movement, yeah? In terms of black churches, there's an upswing in the 1980s, in part because the black middle class hits the ceiling, right? They played by the rules after the Civil Rights Movement, went to the schools they were told they needed to go to, yeah? Moved into the neighborhoods they were told they needed to move to, yeah? Played by the rules, and still couldn't capture the American dream. And it reaches a point, mid-1980s, they say, bump this, right? They've lost cultural connections, they've lost social networks, yeah? So they decide they are going to reconnect. And the way to reconnect easily is to join a church. You get cultural connection, yeah? Opportunities for kids to learn something about the culture. You get social networking, you get business networks, yeah? So they join for a variety of reasons. Now, lots of these folks join and understand that the sermon is the price they pay for these connections. They're not buying what the minister is saying. All this to say, we don't really know how many African Americans are sure enough theists. We know how they respond to surveys, but we don't really know because they're in these churches for a variety of reasons. If we want them to come out, give them a soft place to land. And that soft place to land has to involve more than just a critique of the traditions they're leaving. Meet their needs. Give them networks. Give them a sense of community. But it also means folks who dominate these organizations have to be willing to give something up. And I'm just going to say this quickly. They have to be willing to give something up, yeah? You have to be willing to give something up. You have to recognize, one, that you've got to break free of the illusion, yeah? That privilege comes in two forms, soft and what I would reference as hard. Right, the soft forms of privilege are the ones we typically forget. But think about it this way. When you go to buy a car and you're deciding on how much to spend and what model to get, do you ever take into consideration how often you'll be followed by police if you get a certain vehicle? I do. Right, because a luxury vehicle is going to expose me to driving while black. And friends don't always notice this, but I'm driving down the highway, 45 in Houston, and police officers come behind me. They're running the plates, yes? And they don't leave until the plates are clean. Right? But there are things that have to be considered that not every U.S. citizen has to take into consideration. Right? So if you go into a restaurant and they seat you near the restrooms, what reasons go through your mind? Tell you what goes through my mind. Right? Soft forms of privilege, things you don't have to worry about, but things that we, of necessity, out of survival, have to be concerned about, right? So recognize these forms of oppression, work through these forms of oppression, right? And I'm calling these soft forms of privilege oppression, right? Work through this, understand something about the communities you want in your organizations, learn something about us. I mean, these folks, humanists and atheists are people who read, so read something about us, learn something about us. Right? Learn something about us. And then they might be interested.
And